Part 1. At Home in England. The Bower House Establishment. The Bower House was a wonderful find, and our parents made it even more special, but they didn't start off there. The phrase, "when we lived in Hannington," was always used in terms of romantic nostalgia, because this was where Sandy and Catherine Blagden first lived and loved after they married in 1922. Catherine was a Londoner with a lively mind, a sense of fun, all the graces of social life, a huge love of music, which ran in her family, and a few years' experience of working life because she had volunteered as a VAD, a nurse aide, during the First World War. Sandy had fought as a soldier, but when the war ended he had to find work to keep himself and his new bride. The old prejudices and class distinctions still prevailed. Gentlemen did not work, although they might be squires of estates. To be in trade was to be several notches down the social scale. To be a professional, like a lawyer or doctor, was almost as good as being a gentleman, but not quite. So when Sandy became a market gardener in Hannington, in Hampshire, there were those who regarded it as a serious lapse in social standing. Such people were, however, reassured of his acceptability when they were told, "It's all right because Sandy's no good at it." He and Catherine didn't care. They just loved each other and were happy as they were. But their little farm became too small when Elizabeth arrived, and Henry was on the way. A new home had to be found, a new life with demanding responsibilities had to begin. In the late 1920s, property was not expensive, and many large old houses had become run down. The war had taken its toll in every possible way. When our parents saw the Bower House in 1927, they thought this was going to be it, but on their small budget it would cost a lot of money. The story Daddy told us children when we were small was that it was all made possible by the cat who was called Becky, a black cat with a white shirt front and paws. Becky had a coin hanging from her collar, a silver sixpence, the equivalent of 5p today, and Becky said, "You can take the sixpence if it will help, and then perhaps you will be able to buy the house." And so the Bower House was bought. The new house was in Sussex, halfway between London and the coast, about 30 miles from each. You come down a sunken, slightly winding earthen lane from the tar road at the top that goes into East Grinstead 4 miles away. Down the lane you come, out of the trees, round the last corner where Verity farmed on the left, and over there, just below, beyond the great walnut tree, is the Bower House. Crouching is a good word for it, yet it has no threatening quality. It was home for us, and it had been there for centuries. It began around 1300 by being a few cottages that in time were sort of put together to make one house, which explains why it has so many outside doors. There's not a right angle anywhere, and now the upper floors slope this way and that, so that you feel you're walking on deck at sea. The original buildings were before the days of chimneys. As Daddy said, if you went up into the roof you could see that the rafters that there were blackened by the soot from those early times. When people renovated the house in the 16th century, they put chimneys in, dated 1595 on one mantelpiece. On the glorious southern side of the house, looking out over the gardens and the wood, they added an extra floor and an enormous tiled gable, glowing brick red, 3 stories high and visible from far away. It leaned dangerously outwards, inching its angle more and more every year. It was later found that the holding roof beam had broken clean through, and there was a foot or so gap between the ends. This was discovered soon after we had all left for South Africa, so we never knew at the time how close the house was to total collapse. Its recent owners in the 1990s did it up, saving it from ruin. We know now that it is listed as a historic building, Grade 2 of 6, where Grade 1 has only about 15 places including Buckingham Palace and Longleat, and it is purely because it is so very old. It isn't a grand building, It's just a marvellous house for a family. When you first see it, you are looking at the cold north side, always darker than the rest, with a damp look somehow. It is double-storied, half-timbered, and shaped in a U, 3 sides of a square facing you, the 2 side bits almost like welcoming arms. The oldest part of the house is the left arm, a particularly ancient bit of building. Adults have to stoop below the lintel of a door that used to lead to the red tiled lobby floor below ground level. On the left of the central part, the back of a bread oven backs out of the wall as a biggish protuberance. In the centre of the U-shape is the front door itself, made of heavy grey oak, its iron parts smoothly moving. It is flanked by diamond-paned windows, all crooked, like those in the room above and for the kitchen to the right. The other arm of the U-shape is the new wing on the right, proud and straight, which housed the billiard room with its high ceiling and the housekeeper's quarters behind it. When our parents bought the house, the front walls had been smothered in thick whitewash and plaster, but the first heavy rains washed this off and exposed the old beams hidden underneath, and so the beautiful front aspect of the Bower House emerged. This lovely house is in a district called Hammerwood. There were woods all around this part of Sussex, as you can see from the place names even today. Hammerwood, Ashdown Forest, Forest Row, Russet Wood, Ashurst Wood. Not surprisingly, some great traditions of Sussex grew from the trees. Charcoal burners thrived there. Margaret is sure that at one time in our own wood there was a charcoal-burning bonfire which went on slowly smoking for ages. Blacksmiths did well too, using the wood for their forges. The firebacks of the great ironmasters of Sussex have become famous and are now collector's items. We had one in the large walk-in fireplace of the dining room. And of course the wood was used for the houses themselves. Solid oak beams, like tree trunks, made the framework of the Bower House. The biggest were in the front hall, 18 inches or so thick. Some of them formed a little alcove that you could walk into, where coats were hung on hooks, and there was a grandfather clock. These timbers were part of the more interesting antiquity of the house. About 8 miles away there is a lot of open country and gorse bushes where A. Milne lived. The country he described in Winnie the Pooh and the House at Pooh Corner. There on a hill we knew the clump of trees that Pooh was not quite sure how many there were. Was it 63 or 64? That clump was the remains of Ashdown Forest, whose oak trees had been cut down for shipbuilding. These were the trees from which, in the days of wooden sailing ships, the ships of the Royal Navy were made, and other ships too. And the beams in the hall had numbers and marks on them. They were unused ship's timbers that never went to fight the Spanish Armada. The numbers were the code marks saying where in the design of the ship that timber had to go. In all the older parts of the house, timbers from abandoned ships had been used. The main staircase of dark wood spiralled round a ship's great mast, shiny black, that went up to the first floor. Some of the wood elsewhere had been decorated with old natural dyes, made from berries, so Daddy said. The lintels of the 2 spare rooms had little paintings and writing on them, indecipherable, mysterious. When old plaster was taken off the walls and wood in the first spare room, Daddy found that he had uncovered biblical text from the Miles Coverdale translation, first published in 1535, predating the authorized version of 1611. Go out through the garden door on the sunny side of the house, and there were 20 acres sloping gently down the hill to the stream and then up the other side. 10 acres were woodland, 5 were paddock and orchard, and the other 5 were gardens. To Daddy it was 20 acres of work. To us it was 20 acres of bliss. Never was a place as lovely as this. No wonder the visitors flocked here to stay. No wonder the artists came, and so did the gypsies, and so did the Boy Scouts, and so did the foxhounds with the master in his pink. It was too much for Daddy to manage on his own, and the house was very big. The rooms were not large, but there were so many of them that we never did count them, and we needed a housekeeper. An obvious decision was made even before our parents left Hannington. Mr. Locke, who had worked on their farm, and his wife agreed that they would move too and help them in Hammerwood. They were given a gardener's cottage near the main house. It was a low-ceilinged place, entered through a lobby and into the living room. The main bedroom was behind. It seemed to be full of comfortable, puffy furniture, as comfortable and large as Lockie herself. Cross-stitch mottos were on the walls. Bits of cloth and antimacassars and things undefined seemed to be around. This cottage had an atmosphere of huge welcome, of safety, of custard treats, of firm affection, but not overly sentimental. Locke was a working man, a small man, and yet he did all the heavy work. Digging that heavy Sussex soil was not easy. We called him Nan-Nan. Why, we do not know. Mrs. Locke was called Lockie. They had 2 children, Jack, who joined the Navy even before the war, and Myrtle, who was our best and most wonderful little nursemaid. But then she got married, and thereafter we were subject to the whims of other and less kindly care. Myrtle and Jack were the Locke's pride and joy. Lockie did everything in the house. She made the beds, she swept, she changed sheets, she ironed, she washed, she hung things, she cooked basic food. She was always there, dependable, this large, soft cushion of a woman, clothed in blue-grey and fronted with an enormous white apron. For a housekeeper, the house must have been impossible to keep clean, so big, so old, so dusty. Margaret. When somebody talks about people being beautiful, I think of Lockie, but she probably had warts and funny little hairs and things. If she did, they were unnoticeable in her shining, comfortable self. She taught me how to make a bed, to turn the mattress, to make sure that the sheets were not upside down, that the corners were hospital corners, and that the pillows were plumped. And she knew us all very well. One day, there I was in the bottom garden, safe in the greengage tree where the fruit was beginning to ripen, for I was always hungry. Lockie spotted me as she was shaking her mop out of the top-floor window and called me in. Stealing greengages! A terrible crime! And still I do not know how she could have seen me. Yet, if things went wrong, if we needed comforting of any kind, we could just go round to Lockie in her bungalow, and there we would be comforted and cosseted and fussed over. I went there often. Lockie only had 2 years of schooling, but it was enough to read and write. She wrote regular letters to Daddy in South Africa during the war, long letters in carefully joined script handwriting. She told him everything about what was happening at the Bower House. She had an immediacy of style which could make us instantly homesick, and her spelling was magnificent. To this day, Henry and I talk about our vegetables. It was from Lockie that I learned my basic anatomy, because on bad days she would complain bitterly, "I've got a bone in my leg." I don't think that Nan-Nan was literate. On the other hand, he was wonderful at everything else. When I visited them in 1950, Nan-Nan picked up my shoes for polishing. "Ah," he said, "I used to just put 2 fingers in these." The Lockes were part of the family. Others came and went, but they were there, constant. John would toddle round to their cottage and remembers warm welcomes time and again. When Ruth was old enough, she went there too, where Lockie fed her on fruit-cake. Simple, the heart of the country people they always were, and must have been an enormous help to Daddy throughout all those years as a market gardener. They really were the people who kept the place going at all times. In the mid-1930s, Daddy was 60 years old, and probably considered himself to be in his prime. To us children, anyone over 25 was really old, and so he didn't strike us as being especially ancient. Sturdy and strong, he was no more than 5'9", with the cuddly shape of somebody who would take you on his lap and read to you. If he had ambitions, they were not for himself, but aimed at creating a good life for his family and helping his children succeed in whatever they tried to do. When he and Mummy were together at mealtimes or evenings or going somewhere in the car, they always had a lot to talk about. He adored Mummy, 20 years his junior, and probably let her have the final say when it came to big decisions. He wore comfortable old clothes much of the time because he was trying, without any spectacular success, to build up a market gardening business. The whole estate was looked after by the two 60-year-olds, Daddy and Locke, with an occasional hired hand or two taken on occasionally in the later years. They had to work very hard indeed. Vegetables and flowers were grown for the market, and fruit to a lesser extent. He was forever supplying shops, both in East Grinstead, Mr. Skinner, and in London, Selfridges, with fruit and vegetables. The lorry went to London twice a week. Daddy also worked on the wood, but never had the opportunity to exploit its potentials because he was so busy simply clearing the undergrowth and thinning the trees out. There was usually a clearing somewhere, full of fresh stumps and piles of neatly sawn logs. Maintenance on the house and outbuildings was endless too. The house kept on harbouring rats, which Daddy would poison effectively. The only trouble was that the rats would go and die under the floor in inaccessible places, their presence evidenced by an increasingly appalling smell, and as a rule this smell concentrated under the stairs, right in the middle of the house, and that meant taking up the boards or panelling of the staircase, a terrible job. Then there was the Virginia creeper. The walls of the oldest wing were covered in it, swinging thick swathes of green which turned to crimson in the autumn, so it's not surprising that artists often came to paint the Bower House. We would sit them sitting there all day on their little stools out on the roadside, sketching away. Virginia creeper was, however, a curse too, because it got into the tiles, into the drains, into the roof. Every year Daddy went up on his long ladder and cut it down in tragic masses, while we children grieved to see our hiding places go, and thought it served him right when he fell off the ladder and broke his ribs. He also made an extension like a little wooden box enclosed under the eaves, leading off the main bedroom, probably the first structural alteration to the house since Elizabethan times. It was made for Priscilla before she was born, because there had to be more space, and that little room is still there and still delightful. It always smelt so sweet, and he loved putting up swings. There were 3 in the house alone, and more outside. The best indoor one was in the hall, where you could get to nearly 180 degrees. The one in the dining room didn't work properly because the ceiling was too low, but the one upstairs in the playroom at the top of the house was in regular use. Henry. One of Daddy's biggest projects was the tennis court he built in 1935 on a prime site in the top garden. He wanted to teach us tennis and to have the fun of playing tennis himself. Undeterred by the 10-foot drop from top to bottom of the area he selected, he and Nan set to work with wheelbarrows and shovels, levelling the ground once they had cleared it of vegetation. No tractor, no bulldozer. They ensured good drainage by installing field drains and a foundation of half bricks and other smaller stones. The court surface was dark grey or black, a hard court, probably with tar like a public road, and true. Round the generous court area, with plenty of space behind the baseline, they erected the surround, 10-foot wire netting all the way round. Elizabeth and I played a lot of tennis on that court, with or without Daddy's presence as a coach. Margaret and John may also have begun handling a racket in those days. The tennis bug really got into me, and I was able to practice almost daily during term time, because the tarred playground at St George's, the school in Windsor where Henry went as a boarder, had a wall where I could hit a ball either on my own or with a friend. As I improved, Daddy began playing with me, which was ideal because he played a crafty game without being a very hard hitter of the ball. By a simple handicap method of scoring, he could pay me the compliments of playing to win, while at the same time giving me a chance of beating him. We had some wonderful games, my handicap being gradually adjusted as I improved. One particular contest stands out in memory, from one of the last holidays before we sailed for South Africa. Daddy and I played on the very last day before I was due to return to St. George's, and I knew I could beat him, but his placing was as good as ever, and I couldn't get past him. Trying harder, and too hard, I began making mistakes, and it was all the more miserable because it was the last day of a lovely holiday. As it became clear that I was not going to win this one, I hit more wildly, until I was hardly able to see because I was crying tears of frustration. And Daddy, bless him, played his steady game, and beat me and thanked me, without a single word about the tears streaming down my cheeks. Margaret. The tennis court had high netting all round, a good hard top, and never had pools of water after rain because of its excellent drainage. Elizabeth and Henry played for hours when they were on holiday. They called it tennis, but because most of the rallies ended with some kind of mistake and a polite apology, we called the game sorry, because that is what we heard. Oh, sorry, sorry, sorry. Many visitors came and had happy hours on that court. It was a joy to Daddy. He tried to teach me to play, but there was never much time, and I was a sporting disappointment. Yet Daddy had very little time to play with us. We would see him at breakfast, cutting his slice of ham from the joint on the sideboard, and on a Sunday, especially at dinner, when he would give each of us a little cider in our christening mugs. He never roped us in as child labour, though he would give out an occasional job if it would teach us something useful. Henry learned how to hammer a nail in straight when he got him on to making wooden trays for seedlings at the workbench in the packing shed. He was a gentle father, exceedingly kind, never forcing his ideas, trying to keep up with modern changes. We remember his extraordinary turn of humour and wit, a gift which Priscilla has inherited. He was always having fun with words and ideas. As we drove along, he would start sobbing, and then he'd say, "Didn't you see in the road back there? It said, 'dead slow.' And I didn't even know he had died, poor Slow." On one of our seaside holidays, we went for a long walk along a smooth sandy beach into the teeth of a strong east wind. On the way back, with the wind behind us, we saw a tin lid blowing around, the sort that might have fitted over the top of a cocoa tin. Daddy picked it up, set it rolling straight, and it bowled along so merrily that we had to move to keep up with it. At each breakwater we picked it up and said, "Off you go, Tin Liddy," along the sand to the next one, leading us all the way to the place where we left the beach. Henry. When I was tiny, we went to a fete in East Grinstead, where I came third in the egg and spoon race and was awarded a prize of 1 penny. When I showed Daddy the coin, he looked serious. "Oh, Henry, this means you've lost your amateur status." I thought he meant my tricycle and went all round the garden looking for it. Daddy's roll-top desk at the end of the far dining room was where he handled trade correspondence and contact with bureaucracy about the market garden, as well as management of a modest share portfolio and the normal chores of family and household. Mammon was the general term, while business envelopes in the post all came from Popsky and Loopy, who were comic characters in the early days of cartoon strips. One day, Daddy beamed with delight on opening a dull envelope at the breakfast table. "How lovely! Popsky and Loopy have invited us to a party, and they've sent the money for the bus." Some official, probably in Ag and Fish, the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries, had compensated for a minor overpayment by solemnly enclosing a cheque for the sum of 1 penny. That was the sort of thing he did to make ordinary things special. At mealtimes he had a way of making up tiny rituals that mattered to us. Take cutlery. "Look," he said, "the knives are not all the same. See, you've got a big crown." That was all part of the design on the bone-handled knives. Big crowns were very high-ranking. The top one was called SSP, for Sheffield Steel Products. Then there were lower ones. The lowest one said XY. If you had that, that was the pits. And whatever we drank, water or fruit juice or cider, we'd drink from our silver christening mugs, some of which are still around now. He was energetic in all kinds of ways. In the far dining room were a couple of framed photographs of a young daddy rowing stroke in one of the minor eights at Trinity College, Cambridge in the 1890s. He had a good eye for a ball and, being a natural teacher, enthusiastically supported our early attempts at sport. Most of us could swim by 5 years old. When a handful of boys came for a party, Daddy couldn't resist setting up a game of cricket on a half-derelict pitch in the hilltop field nearby. Margaret. I never realised what an extraordinary all-round athlete Daddy must have been. He was such a modest man that we never realised his extraordinary sporting prowess. He used to talk about skiing and mountain climbing, about cycling, walking, tennis, ice hockey, and there was no doubt that he was very fit. When I think of the heavy manual work he must have done at the Bower House day in and day out, I'm amazed. Henry. Daddy gave me my first golf lessons from Mr. Hurst the pro at Holteye Golf Club as a Christmas present when I was 11. One day, when I was just beginning to play a few holes along with Daddy, I was making my way from one green to the next tee and dribbling the ball along the ground with my putter. Suddenly he barked angrily, "Pick up that ball! You're playing golf now! You're not doing hockey sticks like a girl!" It was one of those rare moments when a parade ground command reminded me that Daddy was still Captain A.B. Blagden. We must mention about Daddy's cars. He was immensely proud of them. The lorry probably stopped about 1937. His first car was called Henry I because it was a Ford, and it was eventually replaced by Henry II. He kept a visitor's book for these cars, so that when he gave a lift to someone he would make a note, woman with shopping basket, say, or, very rare, man with one leg. Mousie came next. This was a large Morris with a cloth top, which had quite a number of holes in it, so that driving in the rain was dodgy. The last car was called Good Queen Bess, and was solid all over, very upright and capacious and dignified. There were always dramas associated with Daddy and his driving. The steering would inexplicably break, or a door would fly open, or, most common of all, it just wouldn't start. On the other hand, those cars managed to take us all over the country to wonderful holidays, to Pevensey, to Liverpool for Ireland, and so on. That's how it was in the early, happy years. The busy days would end around 6 o'clock in the evening, perhaps 6:30. Then we children had to be gone. That was the time for Mummy and Daddy to settle down together. Perhaps we the children would have bread and milk in the nursery, perhaps not. Mummy and Daddy would have mysterious food on their trolley in the drawing-room, things like gorgonzola and brie and lovely biscuits and bread. At last they had time to be on their own. Mummy threw herself wholeheartedly into the role of a country housewife, at the same time keeping her own strong sense of the finer touches that she had had through her childhood in London. The children would grow up as Christians, going to church every Sunday and kneeling to say their prayers at bedtime. They had to behave well, play their part in the household, read what would improve them, and perhaps above all, the family had to have music in it, as she had had from her earliest years at home. She and a few others were better educated than most of the Women's Institute, or WI, country folk in our primitive landscape of scattered cottages and farmhouses, but she would have picked up many practical ideas from housewives who, like our own Lockie, had been brought up in a community that could draw on the wisdom passed down from generation to generation. Perhaps because of WI activity, she knew a lot of people in our neighbourhood, and encouraged us to make ourselves known to them too. From time to time she would put on her blue coat with white flecks in the weave to walk up the lane to the village hall for a WI meeting involving good works with other public-spirited women from the farms and cottages. Parties were gala occasions, thanks to Mummy, who dressed us up and put us in a mood to have a good time. We went to some grand parties elsewhere, but the best were the ones Mummy organised for us, even if the lights weren't so bright and the cakes and sweets less lavish. She had a loving way of making children feel at home and part of a programme. The old house was big enough to have lots of children romping around in it, because there were plenty of rooms, even if none of them were particularly large. Best of all, there were 2 staircases, so there was always an escape route if you were being pursued. Mummy would play the piano for musical games like musical chairs and oranges and lemons. Henry loved the lilting music for the dancing game Sir Roger de Coverley. Henry. At the age of 8 or so, I fell in love for the first time with a little girl at Charlotte Calburn's party in Cowden, immediately realising that I must try to make a good impression on her mother if I were to have a hope of winning her heart. Never saw her again, of course. No one will ever know how Mummy coped with the everyday running of the Bower House. Daddy, Lockie, and we children all did what we could, and so did a succession of nannies. But Mummy had to carry the main burden of looking after the children, preparing meals, doing the laundry, mending clothes, cleaning house, and so on. Cooking was done on a coal stove, which also heated the water for bathrooms and basins. There was no washing machine, no vacuum cleaner. Until the mid-1930s we had no mains water supply. Water was piped from a pond on the road to East Grinstead, or we pumped fresh water by hand from the well in the backyard, which was said to go down into a never-failing underground river. Mummy often looked hot as she cooked meals in the steamy kitchen, all the more steamy in winter, when there would be laundry drying on a wooden rack that you pulled up to the ceiling with rope and pulleys. She never made us feel that we had to spend our days doing housework, though she had called on us to help from time to time. We'd pick peas and shell them, top and tail gooseberries, fetch tomatoes from the fragrant greenhouses. Serving hot meals must have been a constant trial, because the kitchen and dining room were at opposite ends of the house. But Mummy didn't see herself as a martyr. She simply wanted people to eat what they were given and enjoy it. She was the one who had to make the family routines work and make ends meet. Early on, we were taught how to make our own beds. As soon as we were big enough, we were introduced to the proper ways of washing up after meals. Glass first, then knives and other cutlery, crockery, and finally pots and pans. To save money, Mummy would buy a whole lot of eggs when the price was low, and store them in a preservative called water glass in a large earthenware pot in the top larder. In the linen cupboard, on the landing, many of our sheets were made of cheap unbleached calico, which was yellowish rather than white, and hard to the touch, but those sheets would last forever. Henry. I remember Mummy sitting at a rather elegant writing desk in the drawing-room, probably working on the household accounts. She was in conversation with Lockie, and exploded in frustration into almost a cry. "But, Lockie, how can one manage on a captain's pension of £30 a month?" I don't think we were ever conscious of being poor. There was always lots of everything. You always think parents can manage it. I did know that my going to boarding school when I went to Windsor was made possible by funds that were given by Daddy's sister, Aunt Therese, or Aunt Tag. She didn't strike me as being a wealthy person, but she did help the family many times. In the end, we all inherited from her estate. Margaret. There was a bolt of purple cloth, hard-wearing cotton, shiny on one side, which Mummy had got in some job lot or other, and from this she made all kinds of garments. I had pants made of this. Priscilla had her crawlers made out of it too, because it was so tough. Clothes didn't feature much in our lives. We had school uniforms. Mine was a tunic, shirt, tie, and Henry's old shorts and shirts were passed on to me to wear at home. In our baby days, there had been nannies who insisted on bodices and buttons, on gaiters and button-hooks, on vests and skirts. I remember a velvet green cloak, which I could use for winter or Christmas parties, and that was my great treasure. Mummy would come to say prayers with us before we went to sleep and sing a hymn. Jesus, tender shepherd, hear me. Now the day is over. Gracious Spirit, Holy Ghost, and so on. Sometimes, when she leant over to kiss us good night, she would be wearing a necklace of large amber beads, and her fragrance enveloped us with a loving presence long after she had gone downstairs. In the morning, she brought us all onto her bed to read the Scripture Union portion from the Bible. We had a card with all the readings for the year written on it, and it was said that if you followed all the readings for 5 years, you would read the whole Bible through. We never did that, but we used to read verse by verse in turn, priding ourselves on our pronunciation, and we certainly got to know the stories. She insisted on our learning a whole verse of the Bible every day during Lent, ending up as whole psalms or chapters of the New Testament, and on our learning the Collect every Sunday. She was a brilliant, self-demanding person, and determined to bring us up as Christians, as informed and responsible people. Being a fine pianist, she also wanted to give us the joys of music. This was such a theme in the Bower House, we give it a section of its own in the next chapter, where we describe a bit more of how our life went in Hammerwood. The nannies of the Bower House were several and varied. Myrtle, the Lock's daughter, was the first one, and she was simply great. Everyone loved her. She was young and active, and she loved the little ones, who initially were Elizabeth and Henry, and later Margaret and John. It was a sad loss when she left to get married in 1936. There were 2 Miss Cunninghams, the nasty one, whom Margaret doesn't remember at all, this being the natural healing of the unconscious, and the nice one, who we remember with great respect. She was thin, she was quiet and retiring, and she was gently kind. She used to go to service on Sunday, and we used to sniff her when she came back, hoping for a whiff of alcohol, but only getting a full breath of sweet holiness, as though she had been somewhere too sacred for us to understand. Probably we were not nice children for her to look after, but she did her best. She came and went, and then she came back for a couple of years. Miss Rackham was everything a child carer shouldn't be. She was cross, efficient, a busybody, and telling everyone what to do and what to think. She dragged Margaret into the waves at St. Leonard's, those great big rollers of surf, telling her not to be frightened as they bore down on her. She twisted ears when she wanted attention. She made us eat macaroni, which was sloppy white and looked like worms. She stayed too long. Then we had Fraulein, who came from the Black Forest in Germany, and spoke only German at first, though she soon had to learn English. She was lovely, and we loved her. It must have been 1937, before war talk got too loud, but Germany was mobilizing. One of the duties of a nanny was to take us for walks, and this, even on rainy days, was obligatory. It meant dressing in appropriate clothing, especially in the winter, and choosing routes which the nanny could manage. But with Fraulein we had great bicycle rides, sometimes with dramatic spills, and we all enjoyed the rides so much. She had to return home, but was obviously very sad to go. After she left, we had an Austrian Jewess from Vienna, and she was such a sad person that she was completely wrong for our family. She spent much of her time in soggy tears, quite understandably, because presumably her family were all on the point of being liquidated in Vienna at that time, and she didn't want to go back after her year was up. But she had to go, and it could have been to her death, poor thing. Her departure, with the household in increasing need as illness took hold and the unexpected arrival of another baby in 1939, called for urgent management. Monica Dickens came and was a breath of life and joy to us. She arrived in her little red sports car, looking good and lively. Ruth remembers the car as a lovely sporty model that she fell out of one day, probably playing with the door handle. We all fell for her immediately, prepared to obey and help, do anything. Margaret. I skipped for joy up and down the corridor. She cleaned, she cooked, she washed, she cared for us, and we loved her. We did not know that she was collecting material for a book, and if we had, we wouldn't have cared. She took me with her to her flat in London for a weekend, the greatest excitement of my life so far, and she was wearing a grey suit with large oak leaves printed on it. Great! I'd never even seen a flat before, and was immediately confounded by having to climb the stairs to reach it. She gave me a little room to myself, where I could look out and see the lights of the great city of London go past. She gave me a new paint box. She sat me down in front of her gas heater, which I had never seen before, while she typed her book on her typewriter, which I had never seen before. She took me to a pantomime in a special elf-like costume she had found for me to wear, and gave me a tray of sweets to sell to the audience. I was her slave forever after such a weekend. Sadly, when she wrote her book and the Blagden family were recognisably featured in it, Granny threw it in the fire in fury. We never understood why, because Monica Dickens was just doing a good job, and we had fun together. Not everyone has done the Lambeth walk up and down the kitchen with Monica Dickens. When Monica left, we had some disasters, especially the one who may have been called Eleanor, whose speciality was making frothy puddings with violets on top. That was not successful. It was probably about that time that we were shipped off elsewhere.